I'm Maria Daycake, Interim Director of the Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies. And on behalf of the center, I want to welcome you all for coming out on this beautiful afternoon to join us for the second annual Anwar Ibrahim lecture with our esteemed guest and speaker, Dr. Sherman Jackson. You can all hear me, right? Okay. So the Center for Global Islamic Studies has been an important part of the intellectual life of George Mason since 2009. Initially, the center bore the name of the Ali Burrell Ox Center in honor of our first major donor, whose generous gift made the establishment of the center a possibility initially. The center was renamed in 2022 for the Saudi and international scholar and educator Abu Sulaiman in honor of the wishes of another generous donation to the center. The center has always been dedicated to the promotion of a sound and nuanced understanding of Muslim history, religion, society, and culture, and one that is based in rigorous interdisciplinary academic study. It supports and develops research on Islam and Muslim societies by supporting faculty and graduate students in the broad interdisciplinary field of Islamic studies here on campus, while also hosting conferences, seminars, and colloquia that engage the field beyond George Mason. The center has received numerous grants that have allowed it to develop research and pedagogical tools that advance the field. The Abu Sulaiman Center also takes as its mission the responsibility to bring research in Islamic studies to the broader non-specialist public. Most of our lectures and conferences are open to the public. Some of our projects have been specifically focused on developing open source material on Islam that can enhance both pedagogy and public understanding. Our flagship online publication platform, Maidan, is aimed at elevating the discourse on Islam and Muslim communities through short written pieces and a relatively new podcast series that aims to be accessible both to specialist and non-specialist audiences. Somewhere at the back of the room, or maybe it's just outside the room, there is a table with lots of information about the center's activities, things we've done this year, our ongoing projects, as well as information about our annual conference, which we will have next week, not next year. It would have been good if it was next year. We'd have a lot more time to plan, but it's actually next week, April 25th and 26th on Muslim women in religious and civic leadership. It is open to the public, so please do join us if you are free. This annual lecture, for which we are gathered today, was inaugurated in November of 2022 and is made possible by a separate donation from the International Institute of Islamic Thought here in Northern Virginia. The lecture is named in honor of Anwar Ibrahim, one of the original co-founders of IIIT and a scholar, reformer, and politician with a long and storied career that culminated in his being named Prime Minister of Malaysia only a few weeks after the inaugural Anwar Ibrahim lecture was hosted on this campus in November of 2022. Anwar Ibrahim became interested in political and social reform while still in his undergraduate years, and in the 1980s and 90s played key roles in the Malaysian government, serving as Minister of Education, Deputy Prime Minister, and Minister of Finance. His commitment to reform has often found him at odds with other powerful political figures in Malaysia, which led to his removal from political positions and even imprisonment on 2 separate occasions. He has remained nonetheless committed to the promotion of political integrity, economic growth, religious tolerance, and universal human rights within Malaysia. He has been committed to education as the bedrock of his society's health and stability, and has served as the president of the International Islamic University of Malaysia and held visiting academic positions at Oxford, Johns Hopkins, and Georgetown University. This afternoon, we are honored to have with us as the featured speaker for this second Anwar Ibrahim lecture, Dr. Sherman Jackson, a scholar who has inspired many of us in this field through a wide variety of books and publications that are as original and independent in their approach to the study of Islam as they are rigorously researched and argued. His recently published book, The Islamic Secular, is similarly published by Oxford, I should say, in 2024, is similarly intended to make all of us think differently and more expansively about a topic that has been vigorously debated. That is the relationship between Islam and secularity as commonly understood, and a topic that has been central to both scholarly and public debates about Islam. Sherman Jackson is the King Faisal Chair of Islamic Thought and Culture, Distinguished Professor of Religion, Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, and Director of the Center for Islamic Thought, Culture, and Practice at the University of California, which makes me wonder how he can write anything, let alone this very large tome that he has just completed. His previous book publications include On the Boundaries of Theological Tolerance in Islam, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's Faisal al-Tafriqa, Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering, Islam and the Black American, Looking Toward the Third Resurrection, and Stop the Violence, Sadat's Assassins and the Renunciation of Political Violence. He has been listed several times among the top 500 influential Muslims in the world by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center in Amman, Jordan, and the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. Several times, as I said, most recently just last year. He considers one of his proudest moments, however, to be his delivery of the eulogy at the funeral of the legendary American Muslim boxer Muhammad Ali in 2016. Dr. Jackson's work as a scholar is devoted to placing the classical Islamic intellectual, religious, and spiritual tradition in conversation with the challenges and opportunities facing Muslims in the modern world. This afternoon, he will be speaking to us on the topic of Shari'ah and the Islamic Secular, between political theology and political philosophy. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Maria, for all the kind hospitality and for affording me this opportunity to come here and share my thoughts this afternoon. I also want to thank you for actually pronouncing your last name, so now I really know how to say it. I had been mangling it for so long, so I appreciate that. This is the Anwar Ibrahim lecture, and I must say that the last time I saw His Excellency, I had a visit with him at his home in Malaysia, and we talked about lots of intellectual issues. And in fact, we had discussed preliminarily the prospects for an international conference on affirmative action, discussing the situation in America, Malaysia, and South Africa. But when I got back to the United States after visiting him in his home, I ended up on the hospitality list for the people who meet you at the airport, and for about 3 years after that, I was treated to the royal treatment every time I came back into the country. So I'm just hoping that after this lecture, I'll be able to get on the plane safely and land safely, and nothing will happen. I'm a little bit worried about the time, so I'm just going to jump into my lecture here. In his thought-provoking book, The Stillborn God, the noted intellectual historian Mark Lilla contrasts what he portrays as the great achievement of the modern West, namely the separation of religion from law and politics, with what he characterizes as the normative relationship between religion, law, and politics in Islam. According to him, quote, millions of Muslims believe that God has revealed a law governing the whole of human affairs. Like Orthodox Jewish law, halakha, the Muslim Shari'ah is meant to cover the whole of life, not some arbitrarily demarcated private sphere. Its legal system has few traditional resources for establishing the independence of politics from detailed divine commands, end of quote. Of course, Lilla is not and does not claim to be a scholar of Islamic law, but he is representative of a class of erudite non-specialists whose distillations on Islam exert a far-reaching impact on the general public, as well as the perceptions of pundits policymakers, and other influential persons and institutions in America and beyond. Ultimately, his depiction universalizes the experience and the experiment of the modern West and assumes these to be normative for everyone, an assumption, by the way, that many Muslims share, consciously or otherwise. This is less a complaint than it is an observation, and I only make it because it bears directly on my effort this evening. As its title suggests, my presentation revolves around such key modern concepts as secular and religious. Almost as Adam was taught the names of all things primordial, however, it seems that the modern West has taught the world the names of all things modern. These Western meanings form the basis of our thinking about all of modernity's major categories, including secular and religious. Thus, the West, for example, or the East, is judged to be good or bad because it is or is not secular, by which we understand a particular relationship between religion and politics. Yet, this very relationship, and thus this judgment, is itself grounded in understandings of secular and religious as these constructs developed in the early modern West. As part of my thesis this afternoon, I shall be introducing and building upon the concept of the Islamic Secular, as laid out in my recent book, somewhat opaquely entitled The Islamic Secular. Despite the clear distinction I draw between this concept and the dominant understanding of secular in the West, I suspect, in fact I know, that some of you will be unable to resist the temptation to process my words through a quiet, running critique, if not a passive rejection of the concept of the Islamic secular, based on an inability or perhaps an unwillingness to go beyond the dominant meaning of secular in the West and imagine any alternatives to it. I would like to invite you, however, to restrain this impulse, not in an attempt to turn you away from any commitments that you might otherwise have, but simply for the purpose of gaining my argument a fair hearing. If I am successful in what I present, and I hope I am, many of your apprehensions may be assuaged by the emergence of two important facts. First, the Islamic secular is not simply the Western secular with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, or in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, attached to the front of it. Second, non-Western, as I profess the Islamic secular to be, is not the same as anti-Western. One does not have to argue that the Western concept of secular is wrong, simply to argue that the Western meaning of secular is not the only meaning that secular can have. My thesis, in other words, does not represent a zero-sum choice. One does not have to abandon one's attachment to the Western secular in order to appreciate the Islamic secular. And one does not have to reject the Islamic secular simply because one feels compelled to reject the modern Western secular. For now, however, I would like to return to Lilla. The key words I want to focus on in his statement are few, traditional, and detailed, in relation to his reference to the availability in Islam of resources for establishing the independence of politics from detailed divine commands. Muslims, according to this understanding, in good faith or bad, might devise interpretations of Islam that limit the extent to which Shari'ah determines every detail of the political order. But these interpretations will not only be modern, but they will also be responses to a modernity that is widely conceived of as having been imposed upon Muslims from without. As such, these interpretations are likely to be suspected of conveniently navigating their way around any number of Islam's divine commands in order to avoid their impact on the shape and texture of Muslim political thinking, if we can speak of such. This raises the question about how reliable for Westerners and how Islamically authentic for Muslims such interpretations could be. This takes on additional significance in light of Lilla's larger point, namely that since the Enlightenment, political theology, according to which what God says is relevant to politics, has given way to political philosophy, which places politics entirely in human hands. Part of the problem with political theology, according to this view, is that religious commitments are closed to those who do not share them, which makes public discourse among religiously diverse populations virtually impossible. This is why the modern West decided to convert law and politics into entirely secular enterprises, as reflected in the so-called separation between religion and state. Meanwhile, given its reputation as the world's last badass religion, questions persist about whether any normative expression of Islam could accept any distance, let alone separation, between the concrete dictates of its Shari'ah and politics. Let me be clear. It is not my aim to apologize for political theology, nor to replace it with political philosophy. But the general consensus in the Western Academy and beyond that Shari'ah is totalizing, all-encompassing, and covers everything, and that therefore there is no room for deliberation over such things as law or politics outside the dictates of revelation, is, in my view, far more stereotypical than it is accurate. At the same time, proponents of totalizing notions of Shari'ah call to mind the situation in Europe prior to the Enlightenment, and in so doing, strengthen the presumed appropriateness of the Enlightenment response. In other words, as counterintuitive as it may seem, totalizing notions of Shari'ah actually promote rather than forestall secularization, and this in the modern Western sense. By exploring some of the implications of what I see as over-inclusive understandings of Islamic law, I hope to uncover possibilities that have thus far been excluded from the conversation, including the fact that even as part of the discourse on Islam as religion, discourses on law and politics need not be entirely based on divine commands. In fact, part of what I will be exploring and what I present this afternoon is the extent to which political theology and political philosophy are as mutually exclusive as Lilla and others seem to think they are or should be, at least from the perspective of Islam. I shall begin by laying out the basic meaning and implications of the Islamic Secular, as well as the fact that it derives in substance not from the history, experience, or influence of the modern West, but from a careful reading of Islam's pre-modern juristic tradition, specifically Islamic jurisprudence, or usul al-fiqh. From here, I will move to the Islamic Secular's relevance to what Lilla characterizes as the major challenge of modern politics, namely, how to avoid the tyranny of political theology, or what many others refer to more simply as theocracy. I would direct particular attention to the notion that Sharia determines everything, and that Muslims with strong attachments to Sharia pose an existential threat to public discourse, since they can only participate in such discourses on the basis of closed divine commands. Finally, I will try to concretize some of my findings through a few examples of legal/political debate involving Muslims in America on the one hand and in the Muslim world on the other. Again, my point in all of this will be to highlight the extent to which taking Islam and Sharia on their own terms introduces possibilities that otherwise escape us. This is particularly important in my view in the context of America, since America, as I see it, is not a mere extension of Europe. As such, even as Westerners, Americans need not see themselves as being exclusively bound to a European intellectual heritage in attempting to navigate their way through a social-political reality that includes so many long-standing communities of non-Europeans. So what is the Islamic Secular? I begin with a brief discussion of two distinct modes of the secular as it developed in the modern West. The first mode, what I call the macro-secular mode, is what thinkers such as Max Weber, Charles Taylor, Peter Berger, and others have in mind when they speak of the disenchantment of the world. According to this view, the world has been emptied of all the various spirits, sprites, and charged energies that used to pervade everyday spaces and prompt the human soul and psyche to seek protection from these, as well as search for their ultimate source, in order to curry favor with that source and get on its good side. This enchanted world, in other words, was the origin and sustainer of religion. The rise of modern science, logical positivism, and Enlightenment rationalism, however, basically neutralized these forces and left human beings, at least in the West, with a mechanically driven universe that has inalterable physical laws and a natural order, but no God or creator. And of course, with no God, there can be no divine commands to tell us how to live our lives. This is perhaps the most common understanding of secular today. It is also why many Muslims and non-Muslims will instinctively balk at the notion of an Islamic secular. But the macro secular is not the only mode of the secular, even in the West. The second mode, what I call the micro secular mode, challenges neither the existence of God, the value of religion, nor the general authority of God's divine commands. Rather, the micro-secular simply bars the application of what God says from specific areas of human concern, most notably politics, economics, and science. The idea here is that certain areas of life should be governed by an authority that is separate or differentiated from the authority of revelation or what God says, even if both God and revelation retain their general authority in areas that have not been cordoned off as secular, for example, the private realm. This restricting the jurisdictional scope of God's revelation to a distinct and circumscribed area of human concern is what scholars of religion generally refer to as differentiation. The basic aim of differentiation, and again, we are talking about concerns and developments in the early modern West, was to liberate certain pursuits and disciplines from the concrete dictates and limitations of religion. As Weber once put it, each modern discipline, for example, law, economics, science, politics, constitutes its own sphere of value with its own sources of authority, and its own metrics for measuring quality. This includes, by the way, religion, whose particular sphere of value, according to Kant at least, was morality, which he saw as the whole point of religion to begin with, a view that remains quite influential to this day. On these developments, even church authorities who rejected the macro-secular and its atheistic tendencies fully embraced the idea of the micro-secular. As Princeton professor Sheldon Warren summarized the view of Martin Luther, who obviously did not want to get rid of religion, quote, "The world would be reduced to chaos if men tried to govern by the Gospels," end of quote. In other words, religion, while maintaining its general authority in society at large, should be kept out of politics and separate from the state. It is important at this juncture, and this is crucial, that the whole point, it is important to note at this juncture, and this is crucial, that the whole point of the secular, as it emerged in the modern West, was to mark a non-religious space, a space that was beyond God's divine commands, and ultimately beyond God's watchful gaze. The Indian scholar, Andre Vattel, cuts to the heart of the matter when he writes the following, quote, "What causes the most anxiety to secular intellectuals is a conception of religion which demands that every aspect of every individual's life be brought under religious scrutiny and control," end of quote. The critical question, he continues, is, and I quote again, "How much space will be allowed within society by doctrinaire religion for the growth of secular ideas and institutions," end of quote. Now, my thesis is that the Islamic secular represents what many in the West, as well as those who follow its lead, would consider to be a contradiction in terms, namely a religious secular, a secular that is a part of a religious as opposed to a non-religious space. This Islamic secular is differentiated from or beyond God's divine commands, and in this capacity, it provides a space for the development of ideas and institutions that are not the dictates of revelation. Yet this secular space, or I should say this Islamic secular space, remains within and not outside the watchful gaze of the God of Islam, in which capacity it does not constitute a non-religious space, where we can simply proceed as if God did not exist. In sum, the Islamic secular may be seen as a distant relative of what I have referred to as the micro-secular. Unlike the Western micro-secular, however, the Islamic secular neither constitutes nor aims at creating a non-religious space. Now, how do we arrive at this Islamic so-called religious secular? The common understanding of Islamic law builds on the well-known fact that Shari'ah's so-called 5 legal statuses, or al-ahkam al-khams, which range from forbidden to obligatory, cover the whole of life, everything. This is why, for most Muslims, the idea of the secular, which they generally understand to mean non-religious, is so alien, threatening, or even offensive when paired with the word Islamic, almost like talking about halal pork chops. What is missing from this understanding, however, and what we gain from a more careful reading of classical Islamic jurisprudence, is an understanding of precisely how Sharia speaks to what it speaks to. Simply stated, Sharia provides only the legal ruling, hukm shari, that governs human acts. By this, I mean the status of a human actor before God for having performed or not performed a particular act, based on God's concrete instructions to do or not do this act. The legal ruling does not provide, however, or speak to everything that a Muslim needs in order to instantiate Islam as praxis. For example, simply observing the divine command to avoid the riba, or interest, does not translate into all the concrete details needed for a successful economic policy. Yet, as every classical Muslim jurist would tell you, Muslims cannot, as a matter of deen or religion, do without a functional economy. It is this area then, beyond what Sharia's legal ruling can speak to concretely and authoritatively, yet within the attention of Islam as religion, that I identify as the differentiated secular realm of the Islamic secular. In fact, this may be a good place to introduce my Arabic translation of the Islamic secular. It is not al-fikr al-Almani fil Islam, or al-Almani al-Islami, or anything like these phrases, which are essentially just clunky translations of the Western macro-secular into Arabic. Rather, the Islamic secular translate into Arabic as Islam ma wara al-hukm al-shari, Islam of the region beyond the legal ruling, or alternatively, al-Islam kharij al-hukm al-shari, Islam outside the legal ruling. The wording of my translation implies something very important about my understanding of the relationship between Islam and Sharia, namely that Islam and Sharia are not coterminous. Islam does not equal Sharia, and Sharia does not equal Islam. We might describe Islam as the Muslim's attempt to live life consciously under the watchful gaze of the God of Islam and within the parameters of this God's divine commands. While God's watchful gaze is all-encompassing, totalizing, and covers everything, God's divine command, or Sharia, as we have seen, does not tell Muslims everything they need to know in order to live life Islamically. Again, it is in this difference between what Islam speaks to in general and what Sharia speaks to concretely that I locate the differentiated secular space of the Islamic secular. This is the space in which Muslims are guided by the values, principles, and virtues of Islam, alongside their own individual or collective interests, all under the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. But it is also the space in which Sharia will not and cannot tell Muslims how to actualize these principles, values, virtues, or interests on the ground. Now, how exactly does traditional Islamic jurisprudence support such a reading? To understand this, we must consider a few basic facts about Sharia. Sharia is essentially the sum total of legal rulings, ahkam shar'iyyah, that govern the lives of Muslims. A single one of these legal rulings is called, again, a hukm shari. Now, precisely in this capacity, the legal ruling turns out to be the basic unit of Shari'ah. Accordingly, Shari'ah itself can extend only as far as the legal ruling will take it. Any limits placed on the legal ruling, any recognition of boundaries or restrictions on what it or its sources can address concretely and authoritatively, are also limits on what Shari'ah itself can speak to concretely or authoritatively. My thesis grows out of a careful reading of juristic discussions of the legal ruling going back at least 1,000 years. What we find on such a reading is an explicit distinction between what Muslim jurists recognize as shar'i, what is grounded in Shariah's sources and authority, and what they identify as non-shar'i, or rational, which refers to that which is outside what Shariah or its sources, or even its personnel, can tell us in concrete authoritative terms. In my book, I analyzed the views of several leading jurists, ultimately from all four Sunni schools of law, all the way back to the 11th century, coming all the way up to the present. One such example will have to serve here. And it's a typical example. In his 3-volume tome on jurisprudence, the celebrated Maliki jurist Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, who died in 1013 CE, defines Shari'ah as follows: knowledge of the legal as distinct from rational assessments governing the actions of legally accountable persons, which is arrived at through reasoned investigation of the sources of the law. I'll say that again. Knowledge of the legal as distinct from the rational assessments governing the actions of legally accountable persons, which is arrived at through reasoned investigation of the sources of the law. العلم بأحكام أفعال المكلفين الشرعية التي يتوصل إليها بالنظر دون العقلية. Because this definition includes the word shar'i, that is, that which constitutes or is derived from the sources of Shari'ah, al-Baqillani goes on to highlight the meaning of shar'i and the distinction between it and the non-shar'i. He notes that as a technical term, shar'i applies only to knowledge of the juristic assessments governing the actions of legally accountable persons. It does not apply to knowledge of such things as grammar, medicine, or philosophy, all of which, according to him, are non-shar'i or rational. Al-Baqillani notes further that those who know the assessments or rulings of Shari'ah do not necessarily know the assessments dictated by reason, and those who know the assessments dictated by reason do not necessarily know the assessments of Shari'ah. In other words, even as they may intertwine with each other, the shar'i and the non-shar'i constitute two different jurisdictions that should not be confused with each other. Again, I trace this basic insight from al-Baqillani, and even before him, all the way into the modern period. For example, as part of his description of the legal ruling, the late Shafi jurist of Syria, Sheikh Wahb al-Zuhayri, who died in 2015, rahimahullah, gives the following explanation of the word shar'i. Quote, the qualifier shar'i is derived from law, or that which is derived from the sources of the law. This is meant to exclude judgments based on sense perception, such as the sun is rising, as well as rational judgments, such as 1 is half of 2, or the whole is greater than the part, and other such matters, such as medical, geometrical, linguistic, or empirical judgments. For example, Zayd is standing or not standing, or the fact that the subject of a verb is in the nominative case. End of quote. Again, the shar'i and non-shar'i constitute two distinct jurisdictions. And the upshot of all of this is that the legal ruling, that is the hukm shar'i, and thus Shari'ah itself, is bounded in the sense that it has limits beyond which it does not and cannot speak concretely and authoritatively. Even if we assume, as I emphatically do, that Shari'ah subsumes everything under one of its 5 juristic statuses, obligatory, recommended, neutral, discouraged, or prohibited, it does not follow that Shari'ah therefore determines the concrete substance of every act a Muslim needs to instantiate Islam as practice. Ultimately, Islam's juristic tradition recognizes the need and propriety, assuming God-conscious due diligence, of going beyond the dictates of Sharia and God's divine commands in the very name and interest of translating Islam into a lived practical reality. A good example of what I'm trying to get at here is provided by an old friend of mine, the 13th century CE Maliki jurist Shihabuddin al-Qarafi. Al-Qarafi picks up on a discussion among the jurists of his time involving a certain report or hadith from the Prophet Muhammad, in which it is said that the angel Gabriel came to the Prophet and offered him the equal choice of drinking from a chalice of milk or a chalice of wine. The Prophet chose the milk, at which time Gabriel informed him that had he chosen the wine, his community would have gone astray. Here, however, the question arises as to how these two choices could have been equally permissible, while the consequences of performing them differed so dramatically. Al-Qarafi explains that two acts may carry the exact same legal status while carrying radically different consequences. And while one may turn to Sharia to learn whether an act is permissible or not, Sharia will not necessarily tell one what the practical consequences of an act will be. Thus, Al-Qarafi explains, while it may be equally permissible to build this house or that, marry this woman or that, or man, or buy this pack animal or that, any one of these actions may bring more or less benefit or harm. And in none of these instances will Sharia tell one which choice to make. On the contrary, arriving at the right choice will rely far more on non-shar'i, differentiated Islamic secular deliberation. For as Al-Qarafi insightfully points out, and I quote, good as a category is broader than the legal ruling. Al-hasanu a'ammu min al-hukm al-shar'i. In other words, whether the issue is economics, cultural creation, everyday decision-making, interpersonal relationships, or politics, there is a difference between knowing that a thing is permissible according to God's divine commands and knowing whether and to what extent that thing will serve a particular personal or communal interest. Speaking of politics, there's another insight to be gleaned from all of this. Since Muslims will come to understand what serves their concrete everyday interests, largely on the basis of non-shar'i, secular, or again, Islamic secular reasoning, the logic and calculus underpinning their deliberations may be substantively indistinguishable from much of the rationale relied upon by non-Muslims pursuing similar aims. On this understanding, regarding many issues in the public domain, Islam as religion may not be the barrier to Muslim engagement with non-Muslims that it is commonly suspected of being, even assuming Muslims' sincere attachment to Sharia or God's divine commands. This is not to argue that Sharia poses no challenges for public debate, but no authority, including constitutions, Supreme Courts, or public reason that claims the right to command public assent will be entirely free of challenges in a pluralistic society. My point then is that given what I argue to be Sharia's bounded nature and the fact that it does not cover everything, mere attachment to Sharia does not categorically foreclose the possibility of reasoned, non-scripture-based debate and negotiation over the public order. Let me try to concretize the importance of this insight and the wages of it being overlooked with an example from American legal history. In a 2014 Supreme Court case, Holt versus Hobbs, the plaintiff, Gregory Holt, also known as Abdulmalik Muhammad, brought suit against the Arkansas Department of Corrections for denying him the right to grow a full half-inch beard, the farthest he was willing to compromise in his interpretation of the divine command to grow a full beard. When speaking before the court, his attorney suggested that Holt was making a reasonable compromise and that he should not be penalized for being reasonable. The late Justice Antonin Scalia responded as follows. Well, religious beliefs aren't reasonable. Religious beliefs are categorical. God tells you. It's not a matter of being reasonable. God be reasonable? He's supposed to have a full beard. End of quote. We have seen, however, that the actual act of translating divine commands into practice routinely takes Muslims beyond the command itself in search of the optimal way to observe it, given the circumstances at hand. The command to construct a functional economy, for example, does not absolve Muslims of the need to determine rationally what would be the best way of fulfilling this duty, which deliberation itself takes them beyond the command itself. Nor could Muslims today rely on the state of technological development in 7th century Arabia and seeking to fulfill the divine command to prepare themselves militarily to meet their enemies in battle. Nor would Shari'ah tell them how to develop the weapons or other systems they need. But Justice Scalia's assumption seems to be what routinely comes to the mind of most Americans, including many Muslims, when they hear the word Shari'ah, namely that there are no Islamically legitimate forms of rationally engaging with God's commands and no need or justification for rationally moving beyond these commands in any way, even as part of the effort to comply with these commands. Rather, everything that a Muslim must or must not do, or even can or cannot do, is explicitly, concretely, and uncompromisingly dictated by Shari'ah. My point here is not to challenge Justice Scalia on the merits of Holt's claim. It is simply to suggest the possibility of a different relationship and a different set of assumptions about the relationship between reason, law, religion, and politics from the perspective of Islam. Holt clearly had strong attachments to Shari'ah, but it was not this attachment, but Justice Scalia's understanding of what a strong attachment to Shari'ah meant that ruled out, in his mind, the possibility of reasoned negotiation. Otherwise, Holt's approach was little more than the Islamic Secular at work in routine rational conversation with a divine command, as part of an effort to find the best way to implement that command under the circumstances. While this puts no distance between religion, law, and politics, it does suggest that law and politics in Islam, as religion, include more than just the black letter dictates of divine commands. This is among the most basic assumptions of the Islamic Secular. But Holt is only one iteration of the workings of the Islamic Secular. Another iteration recognizes whole disciplines as falling outside Shari'ah's concrete coverage. The celebrated pre-modern Shafi'i jurist, Muhammad al-Ghazali, who died in 1111 of the Common Era, provides us with an example here. Al-Ghazali complains about those he refers to as ignorant friends of Islam, Sadiqun lil-Islami Jahili, who condemn the natural sciences and other disciplines developed by non-Muslims as contravening Shari'ah. Their understanding is that Shari'ah provides not only the parameters within which acts or ideas must remain, but the actual concrete substance of every act or idea that is to be deemed Islamic. On this understanding, everything of non-Muslim origin fell outside of Islam. Al-Ghazali responds, however, that in terms of concrete substance, the religious law does not address any number of practical or intellectual issues, including various aspects of the physical sciences or other disciplines developed by non-Muslims. As he put it, and I quote, God's concrete dictates do not address these sciences in a manner that would either confirm nor negate them. ليس في الشرع تعرض لهذه العلوم بالنفي والإثبات. Of course, Al-Ghazali is not arguing that Sharia cannot judge scientific theories on the basis of the fundamental truths of Islam, perhaps even rejecting certain theories or technologies on religious or ethical grounds. He is arguing, however, that Sharia does not tell us that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or whether light is a wave or a particle. Rather, for these things, we must go beyond the dictates of Sharia and rely once again on non-shar'i, differentiated secular modes of reasoning. We should note, incidentally, and this too is part of my thesis, that while such scientific knowledge may be secular in the sense of not relying directly on revelation for its concrete substance, it would not be secular in the sense of falling outside the watchful gaze of the God of Islam. Nor would it be secular in the sense of falling outside the range of the religious energies that go along with a conscious recognition of that divine gaze. In fact, assuming the right aims, those whose calling is physics or astronomy or even finance, other than fiqh and hadith and things like that, may be seen and may see themselves as engaging in activity that is properly religious, since from the perspective of the Islamic secular, religion is not limited to what is Shari'ah alone. Of course, having said all of this, for non-Muslims and many Muslims who do not have concrete knowledge of Sharia, but who would like to engage with Muslims on the basis of what I have depicted as secular reasoning, there is the question of when exactly we exit the area of Sharia and enter into the domain of the Islamic secular. I have no definitive answer to this question. I'm sure we'll talk about this in the question and answer period. Certainly not one on which all Muslims would agree. But it should suffice to know that there is such a boundary, and that when Muslims claim that they are speaking outside the boundaries of what is Shari'ah, they should be granted a prima facie assumption of credence. This is important, for many of the most pressing legal and political issues in America today, immigration, gun control, minimum wage, affirmative action, foreign policy, healthcare, emission standards, and the like, all fall to a significant degree into the domain of the Islamic secular. As such, Muslims can debate these issues based on modes of reasoning that are not substantively different from those relied upon by non-Muslims, or even fellow Muslims of other orientations. Without the clue of the Islamic secular, however, such categories as religion, law, Islam, and Sharia all remain immune to disaggregation into Shar'i and non-Shar'i elements. And in the absence of such disaggregation, anytime Muslims speak on issues of public importance, there will be those who suspect them, silently or out loud, of trying to impose divine commands, impose Sharia, or impose what God says on the public order. And the end result will be twofold. On the one hand, certain powers in America will want to ban Muslims who have any attachment to Sharia from participating in public debate at all, as we heard from a former Speaker of the House, who stated explicitly that Muslims who have any attachment to Sharia are not welcome in America. On the other hand, Muslims themselves will resort to self-censorship and ultimately secularization in the modern Western sense, as they fail to recognize the difference between Shar'i and non-Shar'i dimensions of Islam or Sharia, and how these can be differentially brought to bear on public debate. But let me now move beyond America and try to shed additional light on my thesis with an example from the Muslim world. In his book, The Arab Winter, Harvard law professor Noah Feldman describes the situation in Tunisia following the abdication of Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali that marked the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. To make a long story short, for the first time since Tunisian independence from France in 1956, an Islamist party, al-Nahdha, headed by Rashid al-Ghannouchi, won the majority of seats in parliament and became the largest of three groups that made up a committee to draft a new constitution. It goes without saying that a major goal of any Islamist movement would be to Islamicize government, which for many meant installing Sharia as the basis of the constitutional order. The mere proposal, however, to mention Sharia in the Constitution led to public outcry, and the secularist members of the Constitutional Committee rejected Shari'ah's mention outright. But al-Nahda had the votes to prevail and insisted that Shari'ah must be explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. The vote of the full committee confirmed their wishes, but al-Ghanouchi wanted neither to clash with the secularists nor to risk further alienating Tunisian society at large. So he insisted that the vote be retaken and threatened to resign from the committee if it came out the same way. A new vote was taken, and in March of 2012, it was announced that Shari'ah would not be mentioned in the Constitution. Thelma does not provide in detail the precise reasons behind these respective positions. In his own writings, however, al-Ghanouchi makes 2 points that I think underscore the importance of the Islamic seculars acquiring more explicit and broader recognition as a legitimate tool for disaggregating the shar'i and non-shar'i dimensions of Islam in a manner that avoids over-Shariatization among both proponents and opponents of Shari'ah, thereby reducing fears, misunderstandings, and unfounded recriminations on both sides. First, in his 2-volume book, Public Freedoms in an Islamic State, الحريات العامة في الدولة الإسلامية, al-Ghanouchi alludes to the fact that the secularists, and seemingly many others, understood Shari'ah to be totalizing, all-encompassing, and to cover everything. On this understanding, they reasoned that if an all-encompassing Shari'ah is to be the basis of state sovereignty, the jurists, or ulama, must be the ones who oversee the process of promulgating law and policy, since only they could be assumed to be qualified to deduce Shari'ah from its sources, the Quran, the Sunnah, and the like. On this popular understanding, many Tunisians came to harbor precisely the kinds of fears about political theology that I cited from Lilla in my opening statement. An unassailable, unquestionable, revealed law that covers the whole and every detail of human affairs. In this capacity, Shari'ah threatened to annihilate that space that I spoke of above, where secular ideas and institutions are allowed to grow. That is, where the distinction between the shar'i and the non-shar'i is observed, and where the difference, for example, between Shari'ah's economic parameters on the one hand and the actual content of economic policy on the other is duly recognized and operationalized. Al-Ghanouchi challenged the notion that Shari'ah speaks concretely and authoritatively to everything. And with this, he also called into question the all-encompassing authority of the ulama as Shari'ah's representatives. He noted, for example, that Shari'ah prescribes no concrete institutional form for a parliament or governing body. And even the notion of the caliphate leaves open many questions of detail. For example, how many ministries there should be, what precise jurisdictions they shall have, and how long their occupants shall serve. In a similar vein, he insists that not every kind of legislation that is needed, for example, regulations regarding the economy, foreign policy, or education, can be produced on the basis of the kinds of skills and knowledge traditionally mastered by their ulama. As al-Ghanouchi saw things, over-inclusive notions of Shari'ah, and thus the authority of its representatives, bred not only opposition to mentioning Shari'ah in the Constitution, but also opposition to the very idea of any Islamist government exercising political power at all. These concerns are confirmed and further amplified by a second point al-Ghanouchi makes in an interview in March of 2013. There he states, quote, "It is clear that Tunisians from across the political spectrum agree that Islam is the religion of the state. They are apprehensive, however, when it comes to Shari'ah, given how badly it has been implemented in modern times, to the point that large cross-sections of women and the elite classes are simply afraid of it." End of quote. There are 3 points to be noted about the difficulties al-Ghanouchi saw himself facing. First, it was clear to his mind, rightly or wrongly, that most Tunisians did not seek a secular society in the modern Western sense of laicité. But widespread, over-inclusive notions of Shari'ah tended to push many of them precisely in that direction. Shari'ah had come to be perceived by many as an omnivorous leviathan that could not be tamed but could only be put down. Second, it bears repeating that al-Ghannouchi clearly recognized that Shari'ah as a bounded entity that did not speak to everything, in essentially the same sense that classical Muslim jurists recognize this very same fact. Absent the advantage of a formal theory such as the Islamic Secular, however, al-Ghannouchi could only articulate this recognition in vague, under-theorized terms that could not overcome the deeply ingrained suspicions among secularists and others about Shariah's totalitarian pretensions. Nor could he assuage, on the other hand, the misgivings among Islamists who thought that Shariah should be the concrete basis of absolutely everything. This landed Tunisian society between the proverbial rock of theocracy and the hard place of secularism. Third and relatedly, reminiscent of al-Ghazali, Ghannouchi recognized that in terms of concrete substance, there are whole spheres and disciplines that are critical to Muslim society and Muslim statecraft, but to which Sharia does not speak concretely. And again, without a formal theory such as the Islamic Secular, it is difficult to grant these spheres and disciplines their proper due without also implying the diminished relevance and authority of Islam or Sharia. It is not my contention in all of this that al-Ghannouchi was right or wrong in deciding to remove Sharia's mention from the Constitution. To my mind, however, these events underscore the fundamental importance of the Islamic Secular. Even if I am only half right about what actually transpired in Tunisia, it seems clear to me that had al-Ghannouchi enjoyed the benefit of widespread recognition of the Islamic Secular and its implications, it would have been easier for him both to assuage Tunisian fears about Sharia and to be believed in his promise to give due consideration both to Sharia and to the kinds of skills, disciplines, and personnel needed to develop the country. Many of these skills, disciplines, and personnel could be recognized as non-shar'i, and thus not the dictates of divine commands, nor the preserve of their ulama. At the same time, they could be seen as religious, that is, as falling within the purview of the divine gaze of the God of Islam, and thus not necessarily representative of secularization in the modern Western sense. In other words, on the widespread recognition of the Islamic Secular as an analytical and generative tool, everyone would know, for example, that the substance of parliamentary procedure, economic policy, or emission standards would not be unilaterally set by their ulama. Yet everyone would also know that in going beyond Sharia on these and related matters, Tunisians would not necessarily be in contravention of Islam. In fact, a further advantage of recognizing the Islamic Secular would be that because the bulk of these kinds of decisions would be non-shar'i in nature, they could change with time and necessity without relying on Sharia on the one hand and without offending Sharia or Islam on the other. Of course, this analysis has relevance beyond Tunisia and can be applied to Muslim societies across the board. For example, while I have not really followed the developments in His Excellency's Anwar Ibrahim's Malaysia, when I read some of the back and forth between members of the Malaysian bar and Islamically oriented activists and politicians over such questions as to whether Malaysia is a secular or an Islamic state, it seems clear to me that these exchanges could benefit much from the insights, logic, and provisions of the Islamic Secular. For if nothing else, the Islamic Secular introduces alternative to the zero-sum conception of the secular and the religious as mutually exclusive rivals. While there's obviously more that could be said about all of this, let me see if I can conclude here with a note or two about some of the takeaways of my presentation. First, I thought you'd be glad that I said conclude, right? First, I I acknowledge that I have not solved Lilith's problem of how to transition fully from political theology to political philosophy, where politics is placed entirely in human hands and what God has to say is reduced to irrelevance. Frankly, I think that there are too many divine commands relative to politics that Muslims simply remain unwilling to give up. And yet, I have also called into question the idea that politics for Muslims is entirely an expression of political theology, that it is entirely dependent upon divine commands. This applies to both Muslim majority countries and to places where Muslims are a minority. Ultimately, while the Islamic Secular does not negate the relationship between Shari'ah and politics, it frustrates the assumption that the two are identical, that Shari'ah is politics for Muslims, and that politics for Muslims is nothing but Shari'ah. Second, I hope I have made it clear that the notion that Islam has few traditional resources for establishing the independence of politics from detailed divine commands calls for reconsideration. So too does the idea that religion and rationality are mutually exclusive, or as Justice Scalia put it, religious beliefs aren't reasonable. Certainly if he meant, as I think he did, that divine commands are impervious to legitimate rational negotiation, especially for those with sincere religious commitments. If we extend this insight to Lilith's broader question about political philosophy, I think there's a case to be made that Islam, in the form of the Islamic Secular, can avert many of the problems of political theology and do much of the work of political philosophy without compromising Islam's status as religion. In fact, Islam can engage with political philosophy not as a gesture towards Western secularization, but rather in the very name of Islam as religion. This brings me to my final point. Certainly regarding the Muslim world, the idea of a full transition from political theology to political philosophy may not be as categorically appealing as many in the West may think. This is not only because it implies a full transition from a God-centered to a macro-secular vision of society, but also because many still see practical advantages to preserving political theology. In the West, the very mention of Shari'ah tends to conjure up disturbing images of stonings, amputations, and the subjugation of women. In the Muslim world, however, as one non-Muslim Western scholar notes in his study of a modern Muslim state, Shari'ah is often viewed as the most reliable guarantor of rights. In fact, this scholar notes that the influence and prestige of Shari'ah's traditional ulama operate as the most effective constitutional check on the ruler. In other words, the concept of God-given rights acts as a bulwark against dictatorial drift and the parallel erosion of rights. Even in the US, due to what many see as the excesses of liberal and then postmodernist thought, there is a growing sense that the notion of rights is under threat. The idea that all rights are based either on reason or convention, rather than being grounded in nature or anything transcendent in which Americans still collectively believe, makes it difficult to anchor and sustain a reliable regime of rights. In this context, though it may be far from an entirely problem-free construct, many may seek to locate this anchoring in a concept of God-given rights. Building on the insights and logic of the Islamic Secular, however, while such a commitment to political theology will imply that what God says remains relevant to politics, it need not imply that only what God says is relevant to politics. Conversely, with all due respect to Lilith, from the perspective of the Islamic Secular, it is not necessary to place politics entirely in human hands in order for what humans have to say about politics to remain relevant to how we go about constructing our political order. Thank you very much.